Hi, and welcome to another Fireside Chat from the Irregular Warfare Initiatives Project Europe. I'm Arminako Hanisyan, Engagements Deputy Director at IWI and a combat veteran of the Russo-Ukrainian War. Project Europe aims to bring serious voices into public debate, particularly where clarity is most lacking. Today's guest is Dr. Kristi Raik, Director of the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn, and one of the clearest voices on European strategic affairs. We'll be talking about the limits of solidarity, the West's ongoing hesitation over Ukraine, and how the Nordic Baltic states are helping shape NATO's future. So let's get into it. Dr. Raik, thank you for accepting our invitation. And my first and urgent question would be that you have actually anticipated the uncertainty inside the EU, especially around reliance on the US. Is there a risk we sleepwalk into a strategic irrelevance?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. It's a really pleasure to talk to you. And indeed, it has been a long time concern in my work that Europe has not been doing enough for its own security and defense for many years. It has not been taking the Russian threat seriously enough. And it has not done enough to support Ukraine and also the other eastern neighbors of the EU against the pressure that they have been facing from the side of Russia. So when Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine happened in February 2022, it was a shock to Europe, of course. That was when we heard Germany for the first time talking about Zeitenwende. There were some new decisions taken about strengthening of European defense. And of course, Europe started to support Ukraine, not only economically, but also militarily. So it was a big step towards Europe becoming a more serious geopolitical actor. But this is still very much work in progress. And now what we see with the second Trump administration is that the policies of Trump so far have actually been a bigger shock for many Europeans, especially Western and Southern Europeans, than Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine was. In other words, the war against Ukraine was not a big enough shock. But I think now we are at the new level of Europeans really starting to realize that they need to take responsibility, or we need to take responsibility for our own security and defense. And it's no longer a good idea to fully be confident that the US will be there, always supporting us. Of course, Europe's dependence on the US remains high, and I would say it is still a priority for Europeans to try to keep the US committed to European security. But at the same time, Europeans need to move very fast in building up their own defense capabilities, also preparing to take over the support to Ukraine that has been given by the US during the past 3 years. At the moment, it doesn't look like the US will continue military assistance to Ukraine beyond the decisions that are now being implemented that were taken still by the Biden administration. So it's up to the Europeans to take on that responsibility. And when we look at the world more broadly, we are in this very turbulent period. The old order that was created after the Second World War is falling into pieces. The US is no longer interested in protecting it. We have the big players, the US, China, Russia trying to be at the same level with them, although its resources are much smaller. And they are playing their very tough geopolitical games. I think they think in terms of spheres of influence. And then Europe is in this situation where it is still not a fully fledged geopolitical actor. It is still not clear if Europe can be a major power in its own right in this new world where rules and norms are being broken by the big players, and everyone is kind of fighting to maximize their power, their influence, their control over other smaller states. But of course, Europe would like to keep still this old rules-based order, but Europe is not quite able to do it, at least not on the global scale. So now I think Europe's task is to do everything it can to protect the key security norms in Europe regionally with regard to Ukraine, with regard to other European countries, so that Europeans can defend their own sovereignty, their own security, are able to defend themselves against the Russian threat. And this is something that I think now we see faster movement than ever before by many European countries, but it's still kind of too early to tell if this will be enough.
Thank you very much for such a comprehensive reply. Actually, I'm wondering, obviously, the need to change the architecture of European security is not a mere rhetoric any longer, but there are still states within the Europe that are in sort of denial. Is there any certain red flag to your mind that would be a trigger to rise the tempo of preparation to counter the threat? Because as Ukrainian experience shows, many of units, many of actually Ukrainian armed forces had to sew the parachute on the fly. And what can safeguard Europe from repeating and falling into this situation again?
Well, the countries that are now most serious in working for their security and defense are countries in Northern Europe, Nordic Baltic states, Poland. They are the ones who have this very clear understanding of the Russian threat and of the importance of doing the maximum to support Ukraine. And they really do both. That is also one challenge for Europeans now, that you need to build up your defense capabilities to meet the requirements of NATO. And this is what the US is watching most closely and expecting Europeans to, so to say, carry their share of the burden. And NATO has its very specific defense plans, which were adopted at the Vilnius summit 2 years ago. And European countries are struggling to kind of provide all the capabilities that are needed for the implementation of these NATO defense plans. But at the same time, we know, of course, that the situation in Ukraine is really urgent. As I said, the US might end supporting Ukraine militarily. So Europeans will need to fill that gap. And that is more urgent even than meeting the NATO requirements, in the sense that as long as the fighting continues in Ukraine, Russia is not likely to open another front somewhere else. So the Ukrainians are kind of allowing us, other European countries, to kind of buy time and to prepare for the time when maybe we will need to be defending ourselves. Of course, the aim is to prevent any broader Russian attack or Russian attack against other European countries, to prevent it from happening, to build up strong enough deterrence so that the Russians will not do it. But assisting Ukraine is all part of the same picture, that if Europeans are successful in supporting Ukraine so that Ukraine can maintain its independence, its sovereignty, and move on as a European state integrating to Europe, then of course Russia will be more easily deterred elsewhere. So this is what the Northern European countries, I think, understand more clearly, and they have this sense of existential threat to their own security. The UK, I think, also is closer to our strategic view, and it has always had a kind of understanding of Russia, which has been kind of closer to let's say the Baltic or Polish understanding than the German or the French view. Now the big question is, what is Germany's answer to this new geopolitical reality? And I think there are some really encouraging signs that the next German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, intends to invest like hundreds of billions of additional euros to defense and infrastructure in Germany. This is really going to be critical for Europe's ability to defend itself, and also for defending Central and Eastern Europe against the Russian threat. I think without a strong German contribution, it will be very hard to do it. And then we have the French view. The French, as we know, have for many years been talking about the need for a greater European autonomy. Strategic autonomy has been their favorite buzzword. For me, the main problem with the French narrative was always that they had this geopolitical argument that Europe needs to be less dependent on the US, which in principle actually is a good idea. But then the problem was that the French assessment of the Russian threat prior to the full-scale war in Ukraine was not in line with the understanding of Russia's neighboring countries. And also the French did not actually invest sufficiently in European defense in order for Europe to be credibly an autonomous player. So there was a lot of talk, but not really action that would make this talk credible. Now I believe there have been important shifts in the French strategic view on European security, on the role of Ukraine, the Russian threat. President Emmanuel Macron of France, I think before the full-scale war, was believing that he might be able to reach some kind of deal with Putin and agree on a new European security architecture. And then he saw that the Russian actions were not really indicating any willingness of Russia to have to be committed to a norms-based security in Europe. So I think the French have now a clearer understanding of the Russian threat. But the key question is if this northern view is then something that can be an example, a model for other countries. Poland and the Baltic states are now leading the way in terms of defense spending. They are all moving towards 5% of GDP in defense spending. They are also the leading supporters of Ukraine together with the Nordic countries. And we need more of this kind of approach in Europe in order for Europe to be able to take care of its security. But for countries that are further away from Russia geographically, of course, the perception is still a bit different. The thinking in Southern Europe is often that, well, we won't have the Russian tanks rolling over to our territories. Why should we invest so much in defense where we have our own social problems to deal with? Of course, all of our countries have our social problems to deal with. Estonia also has difficulties to fund social security and healthcare and education because we are now increasing defense spending very rapidly. But we have this understanding that without defense, without security, you lose everything. Then there is no point anymore in talking about education and healthcare if you lose the very basis of your sovereignty. And I think the Southern European countries should also be convinced that, and this is the task for the Eastern flank countries, to try to convince them that we are in this situation together, that we can't really have these different kind of approaches to security in different European countries. If one country will get into conflict or get under attack, then Europe is so closely integrated that it will immediately have an effect on everyone. And especially if we are talking about the member state of the EU or NATO, these two organizations have been the fundament of European security. So if any member state will be under attack, it will have really dramatic, massive impact on all European countries. And this is the understanding that we need to still strengthen across Europe.
Thank you very much. To be honest, I doubt that the reliance on Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty is all-encompassing because, like you have already mentioned, there isn't a similar approach to same threats from within the Europe. And in your recent article, you described the option of being into NATO or outside NATO for Ukraine, like binary. But my question is, you also in your previous reply, you mentioned that the role of Ukraine is being examined. So are there any options, third options, so-called, for participation of Ukraine in the European security architecture, or still Ukraine would be perceived as a partner, but not a part to the collective security scheme?
Well, this is, of course, one of the core questions for the future of European security. What will be the position of Ukraine? And here, my own country, Estonia, and other Eastern flank countries have had this clear view that the best, the most effective solution would be to take Ukraine into NATO. And that would provide the strongest possible deterrence vis-à-vis Russia, to include Ukraine in the collective defense. Well, we know very well the counter arguments. The US has not been actually willing to accept Ukraine's membership in NATO, even during the previous Biden administration. And now this is more clearly expressed as the US position, that they see it as part of the future peace deal, that Ukraine will be left outside of NATO. The argument, in my view, is false that this position is based on. There is this view that by excluding Ukraine from NATO, it will be easier to make peace, that otherwise Russia would not accept peace in Ukraine and will not stop the war. But I think this is a very wrong argument, because if Russians see that the Western countries do not want to include Ukraine in their alliance, this will give more hope, confidence to the Russians that they have to continue with their policy of forcing Ukraine to the Russian sphere of influence, and that they have a chance of achieving this goal in the end. Now, if Ukraine were to be defined as a future NATO member with a very clear process towards membership, then Russia would be faced with a fait accompli. That, okay, Ukraine will be joining NATO. They have lost this battle. They better adapt to it. And the Russians have been respecting NATO's strength, because they know very well that NATO is militarily absolutely superior to Russia. Of course, we can discuss about the exact situation in specific regional theaters, and there is need to strengthen NATO deterrence on the eastern flank, but still collectively NATO has been the bedrock of European defense, and the Russians have respected it. We can take the example of the Baltic states. in the 1990s, it was considered undesirable and even impossible by many NATO countries that the Baltic states would become members in NATO. Precisely because this old thinking was still somewhere there that, well, we have to respect somehow the Russian security interests and take them into consideration, and it's too far to expand NATO to the former Soviet Union territory. And at that time, the choice of the Baltic states was to prioritize EU membership, to work in that direction. That was seen as more acceptable because it was not about hard security. And then suddenly, after the terror attacks of 9/11, the strategic environment changed. There was this moment where fighting terrorism was defined as the common enemy also by the Russians, and there was an attempt to kind of warm the relationship between Russia and the US. And that created a new situation also for the Baltic states to get accepted as NATO members. So why I am telling now this story, of course, the geopolitical environment is very different today. It's much tougher for Ukraine. But still, I would say the future goal of bringing Ukraine to NATO is something that we should not abandon, but right now is not the moment to actively pursue it. At the moment, it's better not really to talk too much even about it, but to focus on other ways to make Ukraine stronger. It's the military support that is the main priority. And this message to the Russians that Europeans are committed to supporting Ukraine, and they are committed to make sure that Ukraine will be an independent state also in future and always as part of Europe. This is what we can do for the time being. Also, we can work on Ukraine's EU accession process. It's a slow one, but still that's where we have a credible perspective that Ukraine will one day join the EU. It's very interesting also that the EU has developed its defense policy and has a new defense cooperation program where Ukraine is integrated. Although it's not a member state, but it is going to take part in EU defense policy. This is also a very interesting development. It has never happened before with an EU candidate country. So we have to find other ways to include Ukraine in the European security architecture step by step, while for the time being, the question of NATO membership is kind of put on the side, waiting for different times. But then there is still so many other things we can do for Ukraine. And then also try to keep this NATO-Ukraine relationship. There have been new important steps, like NATO has established its office in Kiev and has been involved in supporting Ukraine. Let's try to keep that. And then indeed to do everything by Europeans for assisting Ukraine.
Thank you so much. My feeling is that, like, view from the within, Ukraine is not ready to be part of the Europe culturally for some reason. There are a lot of constraints, but from what I notice amongst the military, Ukrainian army and Ukrainian defense forces could amplify the overall architecture. However, the military, especially military's concerns are that while waiting for all that bureaucratic or political processes that are happening, that European Union might fall into this sort of stasis again and forget the purpose of the, let's say, so if in case there is a peace deal and something is being settled in the view of, for example, France or Germany or even the United Kingdom, There still remains a chance for, as you mentioned it, for the stability to take over the security and sovereignty. What else? Are there any means to setting aside the military support? And definitely, I mean, political dimension of warfare. Are there any means to sustain this level of alertness, this level of readiness, and keeping in mind the goal?
I fully agree. There is this danger that Europeans are not really fully committed to integrating Ukraine, and they might be just hoping that there will be some kind of solution, some way to stop the war sometime soon. And then there is the danger that the EU enlargement process will also get stalled, because of course it's very difficult for the EU to integrate Ukraine. It's a big country with many issues. It is poorer than the average of EU countries. The level of corruption is high. It's a competitor in the spheres of agriculture and many other sectors to some of the old member states. It's going to be difficult to adjust the EU budget to Ukraine's membership. And some Europeans still also have this view that maybe geopolitically it's actually, and I'm speaking mainly about Hungary now, but there are other political actors also in Europe that think that maybe geopolitically it's also not a good idea to include Ukraine, that it might be somehow provocative to Russia. It's a bit like the argument with the NATO membership. My view is completely the contrary. I think in order for Europe to be a geopolitical actor in the world that is now emerging, the world of great power competition, Europe needs Ukraine. And if we were to lose, so to say, Ukraine, and if Russia were successful in its goal to make Ukraine part of its sphere of influence, then we might end up with a situation where the Ukrainians are forced to fight together with the Russians against Europe. And that would, of course, massively increase the Russian threat to European security. So the geopolitical argument is really, really strong for including Ukraine. Now, what is part of the discussions now is also this question of security guarantees to Ukraine, who will be able to provide them. And it seems the US is very reluctant to be involved at all. So once again, it's up to Europeans to take responsibility. I think we will need some kind of US backing, US involvement, not directly necessarily in Ukraine, but it is a critical question for many European countries when they discuss their contribution, possibly placing their troops on the Ukrainian territory in future. There needs to be US backing. There are critical capabilities that Europeans lack, such as intelligence, for example, or they struggle with air defense, or they struggle with the strategic enablers where the US is so much more capable than Europeans. So this is part of the discussions, which is kind of testing the willingness of Europeans to actually put their skin into the game and to define what is it that they are ready to do to keep Europe safe. And then we see in these discussions that Europe's dependence on the US is still considerable. But this is also a debate where I think Europeans have moved a lot. Just think of the debates like 1 year ago, it was not really considered realistic at all to consider placing European troops on Ukrainian territory at some point in future. Of course, the problem is now that European countries are talking about this as something they might do once the war stops. And it's not about moving ahead with this plan now as the war is still continuing. And at the same time, we don't really see how or when a peace agreement might emerge. I think we are very, very far from that. We are very far even from a ceasefire. So the urgent question is how to make Ukraine still able to continue fighting. And all these discussions about security guarantees are kind of a bit distant issue, and it has to be discussed, but it must not be done at the cost of doing what is urgently needed right now. One problem is also with the European debates is that we have heard a lot of talk about peacekeeping forces, but this concept is really false. The idea would be that the sides of the conflict agree together to invite peacekeepers to watch the peace. But of course, there is no peace to be kept, and we know that Russia will never accept peacekeepers from NATO countries on the Ukrainian territory. They have said it very clearly. So we need different concepts to discuss these commitments of Europeans. They need to be seen as a deterrence force, support to Ukraine, and something that would then help Ukrainians in keeping the ceasefire line once we get to the moment of ceasefire. And we should not be asking Russians for accepting this solution. They are not going to do it. We should just go ahead and kind of, as Europeans, see what are the interests of Europe in this game. The Russians are not asking Europeans if they can move their troops to Donbass or to Crimea. So why should we be asking the Russians if some European troops can be placed in Ukraine to help Ukraine defend its sovereignty?
As far as I understand, the main concern is like the fear of escalation, like mythical probably, but again, how tangible is it? How real is it? Yes.
Well, this fear of escalation, of course, has been an issue throughout the war. Also before the full-scale war started, when Crimea was annexed, when Russia started the war in Donbass, the Western countries were all the time concerned about escalation. And the main problem with this approach is that it has emboldened Russia. It has sent this signal that Western countries are too afraid of escalation, so they are not doing the maximum to support Ukraine. And so the Russians have, of course, on their side, tried to increase the fear of escalation in Western societies and among Western political elites. They have been using in particular this threat of nuclear war. And this has clearly had an impact in the US, in Germany, I would say to a less extent in other countries. But these are the two critical countries, the US, the biggest supporter of Ukraine, Germany, the biggest country in Europe. And when the Russians have seen that this threatening of nuclear war or Third World War has any impact, they have, of course, used the argument even more. We remember in the autumn of 2022, when Ukraine had some major success on the battlefield, that would have been, I think, the moment to really press much harder and for the Western countries to provide maximum support to Ukraine. That was the moment when there was a chance to kind of change the dynamic of the war and impose even further losses on the Russian side. But then the US and many other Western countries were too afraid of escalation. And in hindsight, it has also been said that arguably that was the moment when the threat of Russia resorting to nuclear weapons was at the highest. I'm sure the Russians want us to believe that this is the case. And of course, nobody knows for 100%. But it's interesting that countries that are neighboring Russia never really saw the nuclear threat as the real threat to their security, because it's very hard to see how Russia could actually achieve its goals on the battlefield or its broader strategic goals in European security by resorting to the use of nuclear weapons. It wouldn't make sense, really. It would create a massive backlash globally. Russia would become a pariah. And then on the battlefield, I mean, what is the big difference that it would make? I mean, unless you go for full destruction of the earth, but then there is nothing left. But if you just want to harm Ukraine more, and you take all these political consequences then that come with the use of tactical nuclear weapons. So in the eastern flank countries, Russia's neighboring countries, the view has always been that the real threat is Russian military threat. That's what we need to fight against. And Ukraine is fighting against Russia. It needs maximum support, and we should not be kind of we should not be getting into like self-deterrence by the Russian nuclear blackmail. But this is in fact what happened. And I think we lost this moment in late 2022, also in 2023, when it could have been possible to achieve a much bigger military success in defeating Russia. Now we are already in a bit different kind of discussion. This question of whether the occupied territories in Ukraine can be liberated is not even seriously discussed anywhere in the Western countries. Now it's the question that is unclear is whether the US is actually willing to go for recognizing the occupied territories as Russian, which is something completely unacceptable to Europeans. And I think a vast majority of European countries would never join this approach. But this is where the debate has moved. And somehow it has become like the best possible scenario in the near term, that Ukraine gets enough support so that it can stop Russian advances on the front, and that Ukraine, together with its Western supporters, can convince Russia that there is no point in continuing the war because you cannot achieve more. So this would be something that we should aim at. But even there, I don't see the US working towards that goal. And the Europeans are slowly waking up to this reality and thinking of what they can do then. But of course, if we want the war to stop, we need to first stop the Russians from advancing on the battlefront, and then to convince them that there is no way they can achieve anything more by continuing the war. And then we can move on.
That's really an interesting question with sorry for interrupting, but that's really an interesting question with the nuclear weapons being a conventional weapon. It is being used as a psychological weapon, as a weapon of blackmail, as you said it. Are there any other threats from Russia that are already existent and are able to influence their combat capabilities and as well as diminish Europeans' readiness and willingness to be ready to fight for protection of the values they cherish?
Well, Russia has, of course, a very broad range of what are sometimes called active measures of influence against Western societies. So the actual threat from Russia to Europe at the moment is not at the moment the threat of direct military attack. That is a future possibility that we need to prepare for, but it's not an actual something that is likely to happen in the near term. But what is happening every day is this non-military influence that Russia is using, and it is trying to reduce the willingness of Western countries to support Ukraine. And it is also trying to increase sympathies in Western countries towards the Russian view of security order and the so-called Russian security concerns. And it is doing so through really broad range of methods. Disinformation is, of course, one that Russians are using massively. And they are trying also to support the political actors in Western countries that are favorable to the Russian views. Now we are seeing that there are these people in the US administration that seem quite willing to take the Russian narratives as
the truth. Yeah.
Ones, yes, the truth. And then in Europe, we have, of course, considerable radical right-wing parties in many European countries that are also favorable to the Russian perspective. So the Russians are trying to create cleavages in our societies, and one part of it is this disinfo and psychological operations to support those groups that are kind of pro-Russian or favorable to Russia. But on the other hand, they are also using methods to increase fear. I think that is also one element. So the nuclear blackmail is, of course, one instrument to create fear in Western society, so that people think that, oh, we should better just find a way to stop the war as quickly as possible, and it's too dangerous, and we have to take into consideration the Russian views. And I'm afraid this fear of Russia in some countries has a kind of paralyzing effect. So indeed, this view that we should just do anything we can to end the war and come to some kind of agreement with Russia, it's quite popular
at any price.
Exactly.
Yes.
We have to make concessions because we just need to achieve peace, and that is better than continuing the war and taking risks for our own security. But this is really contrary to the view in those countries that are most exposed to the Russian threat, where the understanding is that, well, actually, if we want to be secure, we need to fight Russia. That's the only way to be secure. So the Russian narratives, the Russian disinfo, it has much less success in countries that are bordering Russia, because they have a more clear-eyed understanding. But nonetheless, of course, the Russian operations of influence are happening towards basically all Western countries. The Russians are quite skilled in kind of adjusting their messages and their methods in accordance with the local context. They try to use the Russian-speaking population in Estonia and Latvia as a target, and they have found that creating instability on the border has been quite a strong tool against Finland. So they have tried using that. Well, not with that much success, but it did create this kind of quite heated domestic political debate and some kind of divisions in society. So the methods are different in different cases. One problem here is that the awareness of the fact that Russia is trying to influence us, influence our opinions, influence our political landscape, influence our election outcomes. This awareness is not very strong in Western European countries. I think in in the Nordic Baltic countries, Poland, this awareness is quite strong, and there has been this long-term attention to societal resilience and fighting the different methods that are employed by Russia. But then people in Germany or France or Italy, they don't necessarily even see it as a problem or as a threat that they are under these operations. But actually, in the recent years, Russia has made even more effort to influence the big European countries because their positions are, in a way, more critical. If the Russians are successful in convincing Germans that you should stop supporting Ukraine because it's not in your interest, and we can find a way to normalize our relations
in other ways. Yeah.
So that would make a huge difference. But they know that they don't have really a chance in convincing their neighboring countries of Russia of anything like that.
I think that's because there isn't a single family in Estonia or Latvia or Finland that hadn't suffered from Soviets and Russians. So this memory is still alive. And unfortunately, or probably that's good for Germans or French, that they haven't experienced this kind of tortures or being under pressure of this kind of an empire. And are there any means to translate this courageousness or this courage of Nordics or Baltic states into the rest of the Europe, which is more reluctant or seeking for stability?
It's not easy, but I think we have to tell our stories. We need to really make a long-term effort to increase the awareness of Western and Southern European countries of the history of Central and Eastern Europe. I think many people in Western and Southern parts of Europe just don't really know anything much about the Baltic historical experience, and even less they know about Ukraine. Now this has changed during the full-scale war. I think people have become more aware that, first of all, that Ukraine actually is a nation. It is a state. Many Western countries have been under very strong influence of the Russian narratives about Ukraine, and it's
absence
not only
of identity.
Yes,
which is
exactly.
basically from what Putin started the war. If you recall, the war preceded his article, a very long and empty article about his historical speculations and his views. And that's brilliant, actually, that you mentioned.
Yeah. So this is really part of this influence of Russia on the mindset of the historical awareness of the opinions of Europeans and other Western people, that Russia has been very strongly pushing its own story about Ukraine as something that is not even existent as a state and as a nation. And they have had quite a lot of success, not just in the kind of media sphere, but also in the academia, in educational materials. You can find a lot of repetition of the Russian view. But now this full-scale war and the fact that people have actually seen like almost real time the atrocities that the Russians have been committing in Bucha and Irpin and other places in Ukraine, this has been a shock, and this has kind of increased this interest in Ukraine as a country and readiness to also to question the Russian story. And of course, it has been really impressive how the Ukrainians have defended themselves. So this is something that has actually changed a lot during the past 3 years, that Ukraine is much more broadly kind of seen as a sovereign nation, as a country that is different from Russia, separate from Russia, has its own will and its own intention. So this is already, I think, a really important part of then building like the future European support to Ukraine. That this didn't really exist before. That Ukraine was like a bit of a black spot in many Western people's mindset. They were not aware of the country, and this also helps. I think this shift helps, for example, the Baltic countries to strengthen this awareness among our allies about our historical experience. Why is it that we see the Russian threat in a certain way that is like different from the dominant view in the West? Because we have experienced what it means to be under the Russian imperialist aggressive rule. And we have really painful memories of that. Our lesson from history is that we need to do everything to prevent that from happening again. And the Ukrainians also have this experience. Now, the question to the Germans and others is, how do they see the relevance of this argument for their own security? I mean, if Russia were to succeed in reestablishing its imperialist sphere of influence once again in parts of Europe, then the pressure towards Germany and other European countries would also increase. So we are together in this, but this is the difficult part of the narrative: how to connect the experiences of countries neighboring Russia and then those who are further away.
I'm actually wondering, you mentioned that Russia is exploiting fear, but literally any confrontation with purely Russian forces, starting with Finnish war, demonstrated that there is nothing to fear about Russians. Their like declared strengths turned out to be, again, nothing more than a narrative. Ukraine had been, and people in Ukraine had been fighting for 3 years, and again, the Russia somehow tries to exploit the fears of direct confrontation with them. I mean, you mentioned that Germans and French, they wouldn't be ready to accept this idea that Russia presents an existential threat. Is there any program or roadmap how to translate these historical narratives or all-encompassing narratives that would build the resilience not only within European countries, but within European Union as an alliance, as a unity of nations, and that have common values and must be ready to protect them? In other ways, to put it simply, if you had a chance to recommend or to declare a mandatory rule for European Union to fulfill, what it would be?
This is a huge question, of course. At the strategic level, I think it's most important to understand that if Europe fails to support Ukraine as an independent state, then we will face massive problems for European security. The Russian threat to European security will be much broader, much more long-term. And we need to be prepared for this long-term adversarial relationship with Russia. But if we manage to support Ukraine in defending itself, then also we are in a much better position to defend the whole of Europe. And of course, it is about values. This is something that we want to safeguard in Europe. We want, as Estonians, as Ukrainians, as also as Germans, we want to have our democracy, we want to have our freedom of speech, we want to have our rule of law. Okay, it's work in progress in some European countries, but this is what we want to fight for. And we want to be able to decide on our own future, on the society that we want to live in, what kind of system we want to live in, who rules us, what are the norms, what are the laws in our countries. And all of this we would lose if the Russians prevail. Russia is an authoritarian state with totalitarian elements, and it has no historical experience of being a democracy. So it really is a threat to this European way of life and the European system and the European values. This is what is at the core of this struggle for Ukraine and for Europe. And we also need to understand that as long as Vladimir Putin is in power in Russia, Russia will never give up, I think, on its idea of European security architecture as something where the Russian right to sphere of influence is recognized and legitimized. That's what they fight for. They want to control Ukraine, and also they want to restore their sphere of influence in other countries as much as they are allowed to do it. As long as the current regime persists, this is not going to change. Of course, we want to achieve peace in Ukraine, and we want to end the war, no matter who is in power in Russia. But we have to understand also that essentially the Russian system will not change on the day when the war stops. So in a way, this threat will still remain as a long-term one. And we need to be resilient, and we need to be able to defend ourselves against this threat if we want to keep our values and our way of life.
Perfect. Thank you very much. That's really inspiring, and I hope that this interview will be watched amongst the decision makers who will be able to translate these ideas into their societies and build indeed a resilient society and ability to resist this threat and counter it. That was Kristi Raik, bold, straightforward, and uncompromised. Thank you so much for being with us today. I hope that everyone enjoyed this interview, and if you found this valuable, share it with someone who should hear it. And if you are not yet following Irregular Warfare Initiative, subscribe to our newsletters and YouTube channel. And thanks for joining us, and until next time.